Welcome to American National Government. In this course, you will discuss the purpose, structure, and evolution of United States government.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from American Government, Roots and Reform, American Government by Lenz and Holman, and our course-assigned OpenStack's American Government textbook. This lecture focuses on jurisdiction, standing, and the dual court filter. The core question is this: how does the dual federal-state court system decide which disputes reach judgment and which stop at the courthouse door? The core competency is to outline the dual nature of the United States judicial system.
Who gets through the courthouse door when jurisdictional rules and standing doctrine let judges say no before the merits of the dispute are ever reached? The pressure moves through jurisdiction, standing, ripeness, mootness, removal, and the judicial power to end a dispute before reaching the merits. Courts are often remembered through famous endings, a Supreme Court ruling, a constitutional phrase, or a moral dispute that reached national headlines. Lawyers and judges start earlier. They ask where the case belongs, which court has authority, whether the plaintiff has standing, whether federal law creates a question that can move the case, and whether some other court should hear it first. Those questions sound procedural. They are often decisive, and a good argument in the wrong court can die before anyone reaches the argument's substance. That is why the dual court system carries practical force. The United States does not run one unified ladder of justice. It runs state systems and a federal system at the same time. Most ordinary disputes begin and end in state court. Federal courts handle narrower classes of cases involving the Constitution, federal statutes, treaties, certain disputes between states, and controversies meeting other jurisdictional rules. The dual nature of the judiciary is therefore not a sentimental federalism tribute. It is a jurisdictional puzzle about which sovereign gets to decide which category of conflict. The first question in litigation is often not who should win, it is who gets to hear this. A family dispute, a murder prosecution, a contract breakdown, a zoning fight, a patent claim, a civil rights lawsuit, and an immigration appeal do not travel through the same doors. Venue rules determine location. Subject area jurisdiction determines whether a court may hear the type of case. Personal jurisdiction determines whether the court has authority over the parties. Standing determines whether the plaintiff has suffered a concrete legal injury rather than presenting a political complaint in legal costume. The civic problem is sharp because forum shapes power. Wealthier litigants can shop more effectively for favorable venues, sustain longer procedural fights, and appeal further. Governments can defend rules by forcing challengers through threshold screens. Ordinary people may think justice depends on truth alone. In practice, justice often begins with procedural access. A republic that praises rights while narrowing entry points through doctrine and cost creates a gap between formal principle and usable law. The framers built a federal judiciary because national law needed national interpreters, but they did not erase state courts. States had their own legal traditions, judges, and day-to-day control over criminal law, family law, probate, contracts, property, and most civil disputes. Article 3 therefore created the Supreme Court and allowed Congress to establish lower federal courts, yet it left a large share of adjudication where Americans already encountered law most often, inside state systems. That choice reflected both theory and necessity. The national government needed courts to enforce treaties, protect federal law from state hostility, resolve interstate disputes, and hear cases where federal interests ran high. At the same time, no one expected federal judges to supervise every theft case, divorce filing, estate dispute, landlord claim, or traffic offense in a large republic. State courts were not leftovers, they were essential working institutions. Congress then shaped the lower federal system by statute. District courts became trial courts. Courts of appeals reviewed legal error. The Supreme Court stood at the top with a mix of original and appellate authority. That means the dual nature of the system is partly constitutional and partly legislative. Congress could expand or contract lower court structure, create specialized tribunals, and adjust pathways of review. Court design, like other institutional design in this course, lives in both text and construction. Removal doctrine shows the point in motion. A plaintiff may file in state court, yet a defendant can sometimes remove the case to federal court if federal jurisdiction exists. That means the opening forum is not always the ending forum. The initial filing can become a tactical opening bid in a larger jurisdiction fight about neutrality, expertise, jury pool, and appellate route. The alternative would have been cleaner on paper and harder in practice. A unitary national judiciary might have produced more uniformity, but it would have overridden state autonomy and overwhelmed federal capacity. A nearly state-only system might have respected local control,
but it would have left federal rights, treaties, and national statutes vulnerable to fragmented interpretation. The dual system therefore emerged as a compromise between uniform national law and local legal pluralism. That compromise creates recurring friction. State courts can hear many federal claims, but federal courts may also hear them. Criminal defendants may move from state trial through state appeals and then seek federal review on constitutional grounds. Civil litigants may file in state court, then face removal if federal jurisdiction exists. A federal question can place a dispute in one channel. Diversity jurisdiction under 28 U.S.C. Section 1332 can place state law disputes in federal court when parties come from different states and the amount in controversy clears the statutory threshold. The Judiciary Act of 1789, later removal statutes, and modern jurisdictional statutes built these routes piece by piece rather than in one elegant constitutional stroke. Standing doctrine adds another threshold layer. Federal courts usually demand injury in fact, causation, and redressability before they will hear a claim, a formula reinforced in modern decisions such as Lujan versus Defenders of Wildlife in 1992. Ripeness keeps courts from resolving disputes too early. Mootness can shut the courthouse door after the facts change. Political question doctrine can redirect certain fights away from judges entirely. The system therefore sorts conflicts by subject, sovereign, timing, and litigant posture before anyone reaches the underlying claim of right. Picture an ordinary lawsuit at filing. A lawyer does not begin with moral outrage. The lawyer begins with jurisdiction and strategy. Does federal question jurisdiction exist because the claim arises under federal law? Does diversity jurisdiction exist because the parties are citizens of different states and the amount in controversy clears the threshold? Is venue proper in this district or county? Can the defendant challenge personal jurisdiction? Can the case be removed from state court to federal court? These choices can influence timetable, evidentiary climate, jury pool, motion practice, and appeal path. Standing sharpens the gate. Courts do not serve as general complaint desks for everyone angered by public policy. Plaintiffs usually must show injury in fact, causation, and redressability. The party must identify a real stake, connect it to the challenged conduct, and show that the court can actually do something about it. This requirement restrains judges from becoming open referees of political grievance. It also blocks some litigants who can see a serious constitutional problem but cannot fit themselves neatly into the injury formula. Venue carries force because legal culture varies by location even inside the same sovereign system. A rural county court, a major urban state trial court, a federal district with heavy administrative caseload, and a state Supreme Court facing election pressure do not behave identically. Litigants know this, prosecutors know it, state attorneys general know it, corporations know it. Forum is not the whole case, but it can shape the case before the merits even surface. Timing doctrines reinforce the filter. A court may say the dispute is unripe because the injury has not matured enough, or moot because the dispute no longer presents a live controversy. Those conclusions can look cautious from the bench and maddening from the plaintiff's side. Access to judgment depends on when the case arrives, as much as on where it arrives. Appellate structure creates another filter. Trial courts build records, hear testimony, and manage motions. Appellate courts do not rerun trials. They review legal questions, procedural claims, and alleged errors. The Supreme Court then exercises review sparingly through the writ of certiorari in most situations. That means most legal conflicts never become national constitutional dramas. They die in lower courts, settle, or lose on procedure long before the justices appear. Amicus curiae practice shows that even cases reaching higher courts do not belong only to the named parties. Interest groups, states, associations, and experts file amicus briefs because they understand that precedent can extend beyond the litigants. Once a case survives standing, jurisdiction, and appellate screening, outside actors rush in to shape the court's understanding of doctrine, consequences, and institutional stakes. Article 3 creates the judicial power and extends it to specified categories of cases and controversies. Those words were written to limit as well as authorize. The text does not commission judges to supervise public life in the abstract. It gives them disputes of a certain kind against certain parties and certain postures. Jurisdiction is therefore part of the constitutional allocation of power, not bureaucratic clutter attached later by lawyers. The phrase cases and controversies supplies the logic behind standing and related justiciability limits. When judges insist on a concrete injury, traceable causation, and possible redress, they are invoking those words as a choke point. The judiciary claims legitimacy partly by refusing to become a free-floating advisory council. Yet that restraint carries a cost. Courts can avoid broad political battles by saying plaintiffs lack standing, the case is moot, the dispute is unripe, or the issue presents a political question. Restraint and evasion can look similar from outside the building. Federalism deepens the source tension. State courts stand closer to ordinary life and hear most disputes citizens ever face. Federal courts claim special weight when federal rights or national uniformity are at stake. State courts can be accessible and locally informed. They can also reflect resource inequality, electoral pressure, or state hostility to certain claims. Federal courts can protect national rights. They can also narrow access through standing, abstention, and procedural doctrine. The appellate structure adds another revealing feature. The Supreme Court sits atop the system, but it hears only a tiny fraction of petitions. Certiorari is not a public service promise that every losing litigant will receive national attention. It is a discretionary filter. The court usually takes cases because circuits disagree. Federal law needs clarification, or an issue carries unusual consequence. That means the highest court's power depends partly on not hearing most cases. The paradox is hard to escape. The judiciary claims authority through legal restraint and category discipline. It also shapes enormous areas of public life by choosing when to hear disputes and when to refuse them. The dual system therefore filters legal conflict twice, once through federalism and once through justiciability. The dual court system teaches a hard lesson about American government. Rights do not travel straight from constitutional text to judicial remedy. They move through filing choices, jurisdiction rules, standing doctrine, venue fights, motions to dismiss, trial records, appeals, and discretionary review. Citizens who know only the headline case names will miss the institutional truth that procedure often decides who gets heard in the first place. This is not a reason for cynicism alone. Jurisdiction rules prevent total institutional chaos. Standing keeps courts from turning into open political lecture halls. State courts preserve local legal capacity. Federal courts preserve national legal supremacy where it carries the most weight. A large republic needs filters. The problem is that filters always distribute burdens unequally. The party with money, patience, and counsel usually navigates procedural complexity more effectively than the party without those tools. The sharper question is not whether courts protect liberty in the abstract. It is which courts, for which claims, under which threshold rules, with what access costs, and with what appeal path. That framing treats the judiciary as an institution that manages entry before it manages justice. The unresolved judgment is severe. Does the dual court system protect liberty by distributing judicial authority and screening weak claims, or does it make justice too dependent on procedural skill and form advantage? A serious answer must account for both the constitutional case for layered courts and the practical reality that where a case begins may shape whether the case ever truly begins at all. The unresolved question is whether courts protect constitutional limits or avoid public conflict when they close the courthouse door.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.